Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, and thanks, Dr. Mukund and Mr. Mony for that presentation. What I'll try and do is, just try and contextualize it across three parameters. One is why industry should be serious about sustainability. I think that's the core reason, let's say, why we are all here. And two is how does one really understand whether a company or a business is really serious about sustainability in the first place, and then outline a few steps in the companies that I'm directly involved with. What are the things that they need to do to really get to being a more sustainable organization? Why should industry be serious about sustainability? I think, it's to my mind a moot question, right? Is it really an option, right? I think we all recognize the damage that has been done to the environment. We kind of see the impact of it close at hand. Most of us who are in Delhi, we've literally seen it over the last fortnight. I think it's clearly at some level a moot question. Is it really a choice, right? I think that's the first thing we need to recognize. I think the second important point really is that young people and consumers, but especially the young, are recognizing that the planet is not in great shape, right? This is not the way, this is not the kind of planet we'd like to bequeath to our children and grandchildren and so on. And clearly they're demanding a lot more accountability from businesses and from products that they buy, right? And one sees it more among what is called Gen Z, the younger ones, even the younger millennials, possibly a little more than older people, because they suddenly realize that they're inheriting a world that's really not what it should be. So I think at some level, there's a certain pressure point on that. I think third, there is a large scale public awareness right now, right? At one time, this was a fringe topic, talking about ESG, about sustainability. I think relatively, there were little addendum points to important meetings. I think today, the fact that we're having a conclave, a summit on the subject, and the fact that businesses around the world are taking this far more seriously, I think really implies that there is a lot of public awareness of this. And I think the last, if one looks at it, is really the change in the overall culture, right? The world's number one private equity fund, Blackstone, about 4 years back said that they would not invest in a company that was not sincerely believing in sustainable practices, right? This is far cry from a time when, private equity companies were more mercenary. Their idea of investment was, how do I get my return, right? Profit at all cost. I think there's a realignment globally to recognize that the purpose of business is not only profit. A business doesn't exist only to return money to its shareholder. I think a business exists in a wider framework of stakeholders, and those stakeholders comprise shareholders, but they also comprise employees. They also comprise associates and vendors, and mostly they comprise the community, right? At the end of the day, if the business cannot support the community it exists in, it's questionable, right? So seriously, why industry should be serious about sustainability, to our mind, is really not a question to be asked. I think it's an imperative. I'll get down to the next aspect, which is how can we tell if a business is serious about sustainability? Dr. Rajan briefly touched upon the subject of greenwashing, the fact that lots of companies are embellishing their annual reports with a little supplement on CSR. The government progressively made it compulsory for any listed company to spend 2.5% of its post-tax profits on corporate social responsibility. So while companies have begun to do it, I think it's quite simple to really understand to what extent companies are really serious about some of these issues. And let me highlight some of the points, where it's easy to tell whether a company is serious about sustainability. I think the first thing is really to understand that a lot of businesses merely pick and choose the ethical practices that are convenient and expedient, right? So it's easy to believe and follow sustainability on issues where there's a proven business case, right? However, if we can put enough of consumer pressure or show the benefits of security of supply or brand value, I think then it'll become far more intrinsic. So how do we tell if a business is serious about sustainability? I think first is a larger commitment to the community and to its vendors, to the suppliers, right? Not just price. We all know of businesses that squeeze the hell out of suppliers. I think today we're reaching a stage when it's important for businesses to check on the practices that their vendors and suppliers follow. The second, to our mind, asset test is really doing the right things, even when there is no business case, right? It's obviously you do the right things when the business case is such, right? I used to work for a telecom entity, and somewhere along, one of the circle managers came with the idea that we need to get people who are visually challenged to run the call centers. And it was a nice practice, and we said, okay, let's try it in a couple of circles. In 2 months, we found that not only were they more efficient, more productive, I think the returns were immense, right? So that particular telecom company went across the board, all 23 circles run by visually impaired person. That was good. That was where a business case proved the point. But the fact is, it should not take an organization a business case to prove, to do the right thing. The third point is really about investments into ethical and sustainable production, right? Will companies really make those investments into ethical and sustainable production, or will it be purely a factor of price driven or sourcing from the most convenient points? The fourth, which is fairly critical, is about where is the power, who drives the decision making in the company, right? And very often you see in large promoter driven groups, it's really the promoter's imperative. If there's something that he's passionate about, then that's where that is the issue that gets addressed. So I think that's an area that we really need to look about. Is the decision making dominated by the interests of only the owners or the shareholders? Or is there a representation of various other factions? Does the organization also have representative from the other stakeholders, from the vendor community, from the consumer community, from the local community? I think that's important. And lastly, I think it's good to ask the question of
Sir,
where—
I will request you to please
Sure. Where do the profits eventually go, right? If organizations are deriving their profits from a community, then to what extent are they investing some of it back into the community? I'll just leave this last question in terms of how can businesses be serious about sustainability. I'll just briefly talk through the points in a kind of single line. I think one, it's important to align strategy with sustainability. It cannot be an afterthought. If your business is not aligning its strategy to sustainability, it's going to be a problem. The second, which is something I beseech a lot of the startups I work with, is really to look at compliance first, right? Not as a competitive advantage, right? So compliance is table stakes, right? It is mandatory. It is not something that you talk about post facto as a competitive advantage. To move from being reactive to proactive, right? So very early in your company's build out, how do you recognize the fact that you are drawing unfairly from the community and therefore you need to give back to them? To quantify and to measure all cases. I think Mukund spoke about the fact that if you don't measure it, then chances are you'll fail. You won't do it well enough. Being transparent is important. And I think the last 2 points are really involving the larger organization. Very often, if it's something that's driven from the top, it works to an extent. But the moment you get employees across the board involved in a community engagement activity, in some aspect of sustainability, then there's a lot more skin in the game. There's a lot more interest that happens. And finally, it's really engaging the ecosystem. If you can quantify what is your organization giving back to the community, not just in the place where your office headquarters are or where your branch offices are, but what you give back to the community on a whole, I think that's when industry will really be taking concrete and proactive steps towards sustainability. Thank you.